I'm going to start a new playlist or video series on YouTube now around some of the ideas of the attributes of God that are mentioned in the Quran and in some of the narrations of the prophets and his lived life. This is actually a series that's available on YouTube in Arabic, and I'm going to put a link for it there. There's a series of 200 videos. Some of them are part one and part two, so you can imagine the gravity of what this topic is and how immense it is, and then also the detail that and depth that it can involve. Arabic is a very succinct language by nature, so to explain it in English or try to translate it to English is going to be even longer than that. So I'm going to try to um, do this one. I think I'm only in 10 minutes into one of the first videos, and I almost have it kind of like I haven't abridged it in any way, so I'm just going to see what that's like, and then from there on I'll kind of gauge how to move forward. So it starts with a discussion of why have within us a faculty of discerning. It is distinct to humans over and above all creatures and all creation. And this faculty demands the search for meaning. So it's a high aim regardless of one's station in life, irrespective of the circumstance they were born in and where they find themselves in a social economic status. If this inherent drive isn't acted upon, where an individual follows his or her vocation, then they have already diminished their potential for self-actualization. If you're not really certain or familiar with what that is, I'd refer you to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a triangle or like a pyramid, so I'll reference that as well. So there are base aims in the world, and there are high aims, and these ones usually transcend rational understanding. Now, in a postmodern world, a person who searches for their truth and the inherent love that validates for them their life path, they have usually approximated a meaning of fulfilling life, or the idea of what a fulfilling life would be, and therefore they're kind of working towards a purpose already. And the purpose of beginning your inner self-development is to realize that the presence of your inner spirit is uniquely yours. And the benevolence of knowing your inner spirit over and above that of others is like having a knowledge of what the universe is as a whole. So try to understand how from antiquity to the postmodern age, with all its technology, knowledge, and how to exist with inner calm, this remains attached to following an ethical path to your heart's desire. So it's almost to say, I kind of referenced this in the past, where antiquity, we can assume it was like the origin story was based on a narrative of jinn made of fire and smoke, and then light. And then between that is something that's made out of clay, which we know as to be human. And between those two, how do we understand what realms exist in the world and how to understand how to coexist? So there is an expansive chasm between knowing something of creation and then to know something akin to the inner workings of the reality of the soul. And the benevolence of inspired work versus copywritten work is like the benevolence of the universe to the earth. So basically, I think what the speaker was kind of speaking to or trying to allude to is anytime you are trying to understand something, usually creating a comparison helps you kind of gauge how to understand what it is. So sometimes people will say, if I want to understand something about science, I first have to understand what is science. So I can say, well, it's not the humanities. So it's something that you can measure, and it's not something that you can talk about without having some kind of measurement for. Whereas in the humanities, it's art. So it's more opinion, it's more philosophy, it's more discussion, and you sort of align with a way of thinking and seeing how that aligns with maybe how the universe works or how people's ideas kind of grow over time and sustain themselves. So in that way, it can be kind of measurable, right? So it could be like an applied science. So in this way, he's trying to explain that understanding the universe as a whole, like the Milky Way, for example, as a galaxy, versus Earth is one thing. And then to try to understand your human self relative to God is a dimension to add to that. And the only way to appreciate who you are as a human being is to understand yourself within those kind of realms. And that'll kind of help you appreciate who you are and why to validate your importance as a person and the impact you can have during your lived existence. So he relates this by saying, consider if a child explains that he or she has a considerable amount of wealth. So if he uses the word great, this can seem like it can contain a limited and definable amount. So he can assume that $1,000 is a lot of money. So to him, it's like, whoa, I know I can do so much. I can buy so much. Now, think of a philanthropist, someone who has made a living out of donating or charitable work. And just because he invests so much, as we know metaphysically or her, that wealth just tends to constantly clear itself. So it just continually regenerates and it continues to grow, regardless of any kind of malevolence in the world. It'll just continue to build forward. So now if a philanthropist claims that he's investing a significant amount of money for a cause, we'll literally start to begin thinking in millions. So that's the way we should think about God. Like when we think about the universe, that's even kind of limiting in a way. So it's easier usually to go within yourself. I mentioned in a previous video sometimes that if we scale back from something that we know scientifically, sometimes it'll give us a brand new kind of inlet, I guess, as it were, to what something could become as a sort of rudimentary understanding. And then from that, we can sort of do some research and understand where to compare and where to contrast. So with talking about God, it's almost to say, when you are thinking of creating a dialogue within yourself, with the universe, let's say, or God, and you want to ask for something, you would want to ask for the greatest thing, right? So it's not to say that you can win the lottery, someone says, right? And you're guaranteed a win. How much money would you want? People are going to start thinking in the billions. They're not even going to go to millions. Like, just think the highest amount, right? And that's the encouragement. It's when you're asking God, ask for really high things. So ask for continued knowledge. Ask for sustained faith. Ask for health, right? You can ask for wealth, which includes all of these. And then you can ask for beneficial knowledge. So not all knowledge is beneficial to the world, and it'll die off eventually. You want sustained knowledge that will continue to evolve with time and will continue to benefit populations as we move forward in time. So understanding who is suggesting an idea, so knowing who the speaker is, already creates a context for the authority of which they have, and it allows you to build a certain kind of trust, which allows for you to want to invest in a belief and trust. So if you read scripture, the latest scripture that I've been reading is the Quran still, which is 1400 years ago, or was revealed back then. A lot of the verses revolve around oneness and how to understand, before you understand anything about nature and interacting with people, it's about understanding yourself relative to God. So usually the verses will talk about how God is not anything that you can define or that your mind can grasp, which is why God talks about himself as he, for example. He uses words that describe who he is relative to a context. So he'll have like a certain verse, and then he'll explain one of the attributes that would coincide with it. So, for example, the beginning of one of the chapters that's called The Believer, it's also called The Forgiver. And so already you want to think, to be a believer, you're relying on God's attribute, the forgiver, which is, I want to be in the universe to the extent I can as a human, because I know I can rely on a God that's going to forgive me, because my intention is to live and to grasp meaning and to grapple with my understanding and my context and continue to nourish my soul in that way. So the beginning of the verse says that he forgives mistakes or like missteps, and he's very stern in retribution, but he's very expansive in giving grace. And then he says, there's no God but him. To him is the end. So it's almost reiterating that you can feel like, I already know that I can make mistakes, but I have to draw a limit. So I can't just continue to transgress and assume, oh, it's going to be okay, God's going to forgive me. Like, that's just, like, what's the point then? you have to know when there's a limit. And if you continue to read the signs and that suggest you need to stop, and you bypass them and you continue to transgress against like somebody's rights, then expect that there's going to be a serious punishment for you in some way in the world. Something's going to just become like really hellish for you, and you don't want that existence for yourself. But then God says, even if it's really difficult for you to understand that you need to stop, God's grace is still there. And if you are trying and you're not able to grasp that I do need to maybe change what I'm doing, know that because your effort is still there and you're trying your best, you don't know how God might reward you in some way. So don't expect that the intention or the beginning path is always going to be commensurate with what your outcome looks like in life. So just to give you an example, I was in, I think, my last year in physics class in high school, and we had as our final project to do a Rube Goldberg machine. So there are these machines that are, it's almost like a maze, right? So one action creates another action, creates another, until at the very end it sets something off. So my partner and I, we had done I can't remember what the machine was supposed to do, right? But I think at the end it turns on a power switch, and then it toasts bread, right? So I remember we had such a difficult time making it work, and we put so many hours into it. And for some reason, something would always, fail to trigger. And then, so I would stay for like hours after school trying to get it to work. And then in the end, I was just like, whatever, you know what? If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And then the day of our presentation, it worked. And it was almost to say, like, don't always put 100%, don't give yourself that much significance in allowing yourself that kind of control or that fulfillment, that it's actually your work that's doing, or that's creating the outcome. Always remind yourself that it's grace, because then if things fail, or if things do look different than what you anticipate, then you know that it is for the best. And you'll pick up these signals sooner than later when you are trying to understand, like, at what point do I give up and try something else, because this is clearly not working. And with that kind of idea in mind, you won't want to give up hope. You'll want to almost explore like every kind of outcome that could be possible, and then go backwards and see, okay, well, what choices will lead to that? So how do we then try to go about building authenticity for ourselves? So let's assume we already know that this is like a source, because people still want to attribute to the scripture, even if maybe they don't call themselves Muslims anymore, or like a different sect of Islam. So you want to understand, like, what can I do to understand how to align with this power, like the omnipotence of it, while trying to also rely on like a part of myself of some kind, so that I'm not leading myself down some kind of misguided idea of how I should be in the world, right? And that's a legitimate question, especially now in a postmodern world where it's difficult to find someone that you can study with one-on-one and who has the time for that. So consider this this verse, and it says that God speaking to the prophet, because the prophet was born as an orphan. His mother died when he was 6, and previous to that, he was his father died before his death, before his birth. I mean, sorry. And during the formative years of his life, he was he spent his years with a wet nurse, and then after that with his uncle, and then with his grandfather, and then he was a shepherd, and then he learned a little bit of the commerce and trade. So his early life was very out of his hands, as you could say. Like, it was just he learned how to almost rely on other than himself, because it was just like, I'm being passed around, and I just kind of have to learn how to build trust outside of all that. So God is saying to him that I have taught you what you couldn't have known, and the grace of God is always going to be upon you in a very great way. So it's almost to say, if you're able to build that kind of faith in the universe, and not so much rely a little bit on your intellect, like, you still have to kind of rationalize and make sure that things are aligning and you can explain to yourself why you're doing an action. But if you pause that for a moment and just say, I want to believe in this omnipotent power, and I want to almost suspend my autonomy for God, and just to see, like, how are you going to guide me? And I promise you, you're going to find a way. This has never happened to me, or I've kind of given that up in like a time of indecisiveness, except that for some reasons, like fate just changed and twisted in ways that I would have thought were not good for me, but they ended up being like a greater outcome that I could have ever kind of worked towards or anticipated. So knowing that is a way to kind of build that faith and that trust in this omnipotent power. So if you have that, that's usually what sort of establishes people in a faith where no matter what people argue, they already know. I don't have to find the words to explain how I feel. I don't have to validate or prove anything. I know how the universe sustains itself because I've experienced all these things. And that's basically all they need, basically, is the freedom to express themselves and to practice their faith as they hopefully feel is not oppressing anybody around them. So this is, there's no good in people gathering in a conference unless if it's enjoying good. This is kind of to say that building on that idea, if people are gathering in a kind of setting to promote hate against the group, because sometimes you'll find that people will try to assume that one group, this may not be common anymore, but they used to assume that one group could be more rightly guided than another. But now with an understanding that all the scriptures and all the kind of cultures and groups of understanding of religion are, if you study them, will actually be complementing each other. So you won't find that one completely negates another, unless it's something that's close to idolatry, where people will put up, it's almost like icons and believe that they can will a spirit into it and then they worship it in a way. So in that regard, it's almost diminishing from God's omnipotence. Like God says, I want you to learn to believe in the unknown, in the future. Like don't try to grasp what God can be, because it's, if let's say that icon falls and it breaks, right? How do you explain to a child that God broke, right? It's almost setting yourself up already for difficult ways of understanding something that's children already are able to kind of grasp about nature, and they don't necessarily ask these big questions. They just take for granted that this is the way the world works, and breaking from the norm by giving me language and then cause and effect that doesn't make sense is like it's just confusing, right? So so to think about this is to suggest that 3 ways that you can continue to work on yourself in aligning healthy ways of learning and seeing and meaning making is to think of ways, or to ask for ways of growing an ongoing and sustainable kind of knowledge. So we talked about how the human experience by nature is something that we all learn from. It's the best way to educate because it's already relatable and people want to know what's useful and relatable and relevant to a contemporary time for them personally, and that it works. Having something to invest with. So if you have a skill or a talent, like sometimes you'll go on YouTube and there's do it yourself or how to, and people are happy to engage with the audience about how to do something. So that's something that will be like a worthwhile investment. And then building bridges between cultures. So finding ways to illuminate antiquated tradition with a new lens. So instead of constantly trashing the past and saying, you know what, they got it wrong, or you know, I can't believe they used to do this, or can you believe, if you are able to go back in time and view with the lens of that time, it won't look so barbaric, as it were, or like so out of the norm. Because as you come into a postmodern lens or the present day and start to view things from our lens for the present day, you'll see how it's a natural progression actually of how events would have unfolded. So then you can start to think, how does this begin, or how does being true to yourself create an opportunity for all of what we've just talked about to manifest effortlessly? So sometimes people will say, I don't want to be affiliated with a religion because it's too much work. And that's true. If you're forced into something and it looks like this big dark cloud and you have no idea how to even find an entry point for it, you're already kind of dissuaded from it and you just don't want to. So if you are doing it as a Taoist say, like in a effortless way that's kind of natural to you, you'll find that over time it's just building with you. Like you're not going out of your way to do something that you wouldn't have wanted to do anyway, and you're just integrating it into your life. So one of the things that I can kind of relate to is exercising. I had gone through, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 years without exercising, and I just go for random walks every once in a while. And then last November, I got a gym membership again, And it took me a while to kind of get into the habit of doing it again, like going regularly and working up the lung capacity to continue like a sustained full workout. But it just shows that because our consciousness already wants to create meaning from like antiquity, once you find something that resonates with you, just keep with it and give yourself time. Like allow yourself a lot of time and do it in short spurts. Because you'll find that as we go through like all these different attributes of God and all the different meanings, it all does actually coincide with attributes and meanings that are inherent in us. They're all basically attributes of mercy and kindness. They're ones that are called attributes of majesty, are meant for us to kind of pull back from wanting to become. So there's wrath, there is subduer, like subjugator, like if someone is really tyrannical and God makes like a example of them, for example, like the Pharaoh, like drowning him in the middle of the Red Sea, for everyone to say, like, if you're gonna attribute yourself to like a divinity, then you should be able to save yourself, right? So things like that, where the universe almost just comes around and just it'll put people in their place, as it were. We shouldn't want to have these attributes for ourselves. That's different from what we understand of like I want to call them like action movies or movies that kids love to watch to impersonate, like because they love the rough and tumble play. For me, when I think of those attributes, for especially for children, I think of it as a way that's healthy for them to overcome something that might be a brick wall in their world. So if they are learning how to stand up to a bully, for example, right? They need to have that kind of self-confidence that I'm not a weak person, like I'm strong and I can stand up for myself, and I can find a way to do it kindly, right? So watching movies like that where they want to feel strong and they want to feel like they can do all these fun tricks, if you're able to kind of tie it back to how your brain can do that, and then show them, like say, you know what, if I see you doing this, I can show you what it actually looks like, what your brain's doing. So you don't have to actually use your force. Like you don't have to hurt somebody. You don't have to push them. You don't have to use unkind words. You just have to have like a firm way of explaining what you want to have the other person understand, and that's sufficient, right? So then we can watch these movies and we don't have to relate them to violence. Like people who enjoy playing video games or watching violent movies, I'm not sure what it does to us. I know sometimes it can actually diminish the immune system if we watch too much of it. So perhaps that's something to kind of think about. But I think it's going to be something that'll be an interesting journey, and I enjoy interacting with you, and I hope to see you soon.